Try to stay near the podium mic. Testing, working? Yep, there we go. Cool, I'm good. Yeah, yep, no, I'm going to stay right here so we don't lose it. Cool. All right, let's get started. Hi, everyone. Welcome to your last lecture in Biopsych. Hooray, we're making it through. What a quarter. So I'm going to be talking to you today about consciousness, which I'm so excited about. This is actually what got me into neuroscience, this concept. It is considered by many the holy grail of neuroscience because consciousness is your existence, how you know that you exist in this world, in this reality. And if we could figure that out and how that is created neurally, we could really understand the brain to a crazy level. So to get started, I'm going to give you a couple ideas, hopefully to get you excited about this. And when I was younger, I had this idea or this thought, and I'm sure many of you had this thought. I'd like someone to tell me, what colors do you see up here on the screen? Not a trick question. Blue, right? So blue is one of the main colors you see up there, some black and white. How do I know that what you see as blue looks like the same blue as what I see? How do I know that what you see as blue doesn't actually look like what I would consider red? But it doesn't matter because we can use language, and as long as we can describe and both agree that's blue, it doesn't matter what your subjective experience of the blueness of this is. This is probably the first time that many of us have thought about in our lives what it's like to experience life as a subjective individual, and are we all experiencing the same reality? You've also seen in pop culture, there's a lot of different examples that you might not have connected this idea yet with neuroscience, but if you're like me during the pandemic, you watched a lot of Netflix and Hulu and things like that. And in Altered Carbon, they have this idea of this cortical stack. And it's this basically like a microchip. They call it a cortical stack. It's implanted in people's spine at the age of 1. And as they learn and go through life, it actually encodes their consciousness. And you actually never die because you can, as long as your cortical stack's in place, your body can die, but you can just put your cortical stack into another person and you can continue to live forever. And I know there are many shows, especially a lot lately, I was really surprised, like Upload, Black Mirror, that play with this idea. And so this is a big idea. Can we upload our consciousness, our livelihood, into some sort of electronic device and continue to live forever? Another show I really liked is called The 100. Anyone seen this one? Yeah? Woo! Yeah, great one. So in this show, this is kind of a spoiler alert, so I'm sorry if I hurt anyone's feelings for telling them about it. But this woman here, her name is Allie, and she's not actually there. She's not actually real. She's a hallucination in people's minds. And you see this hallucination of this woman if you have eaten a microchip. And then this very smart AI program actually manipulates your brain to allow you to see this hallucination. Allie's supposed to be the answer to the problems of the human race. But she ends up thinking that actually humans are terrible and there's like a whole bunch of explosions in here. And she actually decides that she needs to blow up the human race in order to save the world. So the creator of Allie creates Allie 2.0 down here, which is actually a device, which is another AI program, but it merges with our brain, with human consciousness. And so you can see it's got these things here that could protrude like little electro wires, stimulate the brain. And so this is the idea of merging our brain with AI, or our consciousness. Sounds crazy, right? This idea of merging robots with our brain. But actually, Elon Musk a few years ago launched an initiative called Neuralink. So there's Elon there, and this is actually a screenshot from the homepage of his website. He launched Neuralink in order to try to understand the brain, interface with it, and ultimately engineer it. And there are interviews online where you can see the reason that he decided to create this company is he was worried about what's called the singularity, which is when robots could decide that humans are no longer useful or hurting the planet. And he was worried about this, along with a lot of other forward thinkers. So he actually said he created Neuralink for this reason, to figure out how we can merge electronics and AI with our brain, so that the path forward, he said, would be to merge with it, so that instead of creating robots and humans and then them overcoming us. So crazy ideas, but a lot of people are thinking about this stuff right now. I mean, it's definitely in its early stages. You can see how far they're going right now. They're just creating specialized electronics to record neural activity, new wires, but cool stuff. Okay. So good. I hope I kind of got your brain thinking about applications of it. So let's talk about a little bit what it is. What constitutes a neural correlate of consciousness, which I'm going to call NCC for the rest of this lecture, depends importantly on how one defines it. Consciousness sometimes is this kind of nebulous, hard thing to define often. And different people will define it differently, which is going to change how we look at it in the brain. So it's important to have an objective definition of it so that we can understand what it is. But there are a few things that we can agree upon. One is that it's that which fades when you sleep, and then it returns every morning when you wake up. It disappears in coma and other disorders of consciousness, vegetative states. But most importantly, it's an experience that you have. And one of my favorite thought examples that's really hit home with me through my life is to imagine this figure, this person here, as you. It's you looking in the mirror. Picture yourself looking in the mirror, maybe in your bathroom, maybe in your room this morning, and you're looking at yourself and you're saying, hey, you're going to have a great day. And you have a certain size, shape, you have certain thoughts, certain emotions and beliefs that all belong to you in this moment. But then picture yourself 10 years ago and 15 years ago, also looking in a mirror. And you can look in the mirror and reflect and see yourself, but you will have had a different size, a different body shape. You will have different thoughts back then, different emotions and ideas. Your interpretation of reality was totally different. All of these things changed through your lifespan, but one thing stayed the same, and that was your consciousness, your awareness of you. And this is what many philosophers or Buddhists and people of yogic tradition call the seat of yourself. And you can imagine yourself 30 years from now, and you will have changed and become older, but there's still this core piece of you that's there. And to me, that's one of the best descriptions of what consciousness is, this awareness or experience that you have, just knowing that you exist. Speaking of that, as I mentioned, consciousness has been talked about for centuries. René Descartes created one of the most powerful statements in all of philosophy called cogito ergo sum, which means I think, therefore I am. This is so powerful because as scientists, we know that you can never be truly 100% certain of anything. You can't even be certain that you're sitting in this room right now. You could be living in a matrix, in a computer-generated simulation. Right? How many have seen The Matrix? Oh, yeah, that's my favorite movie of all time, right? Morpheus in it, he says, what is real? How do you define real? If real is simply what you can see, what you can taste, what you can touch, then real is electrical signals interpreted by your brain. So even though we can be really certain we're not living in the matrix, we can't be 100% certain. But the one thing we can be 100% certain of is that you exist, that you're having some kind of experience. And this is another reason why I think this idea of consciousness is so powerful. The only thing you can truly be certain of. So, people often define consciousness. You have a question? No? Okay. And that there are two main things. There's an experience. This experience is subjective. Like I said with the colors, we each have some sort of subjective individual experience, and that's the beauty of language. As long as we can agree upon it, it doesn't matter if our experiences may slightly differ. And that experience also has contents, and those contents can be thoughts, beliefs, sensations, percepts, intentions, a sense of agency, memories, and emotion. Okay. But then, to go on to experience, the other side of this is most people will agree that there's awareness. And we definitely have an experience, and then we're aware of it. Is it possible that you could have an experience without being aware? There's no right answer. It's a rhetorical question, right? But it's interesting to think about. And also, one thing I think about is, how would you even know that you're conscious if you don't have a memory? If you don't have memory from a second ago that you were looking at yourself in the mirror. So people try to dice up consciousness in different ways, but the core aspects of it is there's experience, and most will agree that you have awareness of that experience. Now, this sounds like a lot of philosophical mumbo-jumbo, I get it, but there are actual real applications, reasons that we should study consciousness. So over here on the left, there are clinical applications. This is what's driving most of the research. This is where the grants are getting funded. And they all focus around monitoring consciousness. Can we classify it? There's this thing called locked-in syndrome. It's also called, more popular now, as unresponsive wakefulness syndrome. And these are people who we think are in a coma, we think are not conscious at all, but they actually are to some level. And the only way we've been able to tell or know if these people have this locked-in syndrome or unresponsive wakefulness syndrome is if they can send out some sort of motor output, if they can blink their eye like twice if you're asking them a question, or if they can move their finger, right? Because the only way that I can know if you're even conscious is to ask you, and you'll say, yes, Kevin, I'm watching this right now, I'm here, but I kind of just have to take your word for it. There's no way that I can truly, or wasn't in the past, that I could truly just talk to you and know that you're conscious versus a robot. So for locked-in syndrome, it's very important there are some people, right, that are probably locked in that can't even do that motor output, that can't do that wink, that can't wiggle their finger, and they're just trapped in there. And so for that reason, we've been trying to focus on trying to monitor it in the brain and define the neural correlates in the brain so that we can identify if this person is actually conscious to some level. Another realm of this deals with anesthesia. So anesthesia that you get when you go under surgery and are knocked out, there's actually a very small sliver of the population, less than 5%, that when they undergo surgery with anesthesia, they are still conscious of it. They will appear in every aspect that you can quantify behaviorally by movements and stuff. They will appear to be knocked out and unconscious, but they actually experience the entire surgery. Imagine experiencing the entire pain of an open heart surgery when doctors thought you were knocked out. So that is another big reason that we want to be able to, you can imagine being able to monitor someone's brain while they're in surgery so that you can definitely know that they're unconscious and not experiencing the pain of that. Because that's the point of knocking them out, right? Cool. There's also the philosophical questions, as I've already posed to you, who and what are we? It kind of defines our existence and what we are as human beings with these thinking brains. And another question is consciousness evolutionarily advantageous? Does it infer some sort of reproductive fitness? Does it actually make us smarter? Or is it merely an epiphenomenon? Then we have ethical applications. So we would all agree that we're conscious. Is a baby conscious? Is a worm conscious? Is a microorganism conscious? Right? Interesting questions to think about. I bet you've never thought about if a microorganism's conscious, right? Could they have some very simple level that's nothing like ours, but maybe they are aware to some level? The reason we think about this is because does that change our ethical obligations to animals or other organisms if we know they're conscious? And actually already, when we do animal research like I do with IACUC, our ethics committee, we are supposed to aim for the animal of lowest sentience that will help us get what we want out of our research. Sentience is another word for consciousness. So at least our ethics community already agree to some level that animals seem to have this scale of consciousness. The other idea is robots and artificial intelligence, because AI is getting crazy complicated, crazy complex, and will it one day be able to be conscious? And does that change our ethical obligations to those robots or AI programs that we make? Is it right to make them our servants? Right? This is one of the main things of the Matrix, and they get frustrated with us, right, and try to overtake us. And if you think that that's kind of crazy on the horizon, in 2017, Sophia was named the world's first robot citizen by Saudi Arabia. And you can look it up. So it's kind of already here. Some of these ideas are kind of on the cusp, and the world's playing with them already. Now, I think almost all consciousness researchers would agree that Sophia is not conscious. It was a publicity stunt, and that she's probably just this feed-forward, input-output system. But it's still, I like it because it makes us think about stuff and think that maybe this stuff's closer than we think. And then the future research applications are like, can we merge with AI, like I showed you with the 100, with Neuralink. You're already learning that we are doing things like deep brain stimulation. We're putting these devices, closed-loop devices that record your neural activity and then stimulate, especially for Parkinson's disease to help with some of those motor functions. What happens when you put 15 of these implants in someone's brain, right? Are they still fundamentally themselves, or are they different? And in fact, you'll see testimonials from some of these people with these dopamine stimulators that sometimes they feel like they're being taken over by something else. Yeah, and one of the coolest ones is, can consciousness be uploaded? Could we upload your entire being, your mind and personality onto some kind of electrical device and continue on forever? Another thing that's here right now. You have a question?
Yeah, just circling back to what you mentioned, often consciousness. For people with dissociative identity disorder, would you say they have one consciousness or multiple?
Okay, so the question for those of you online is, do people with dissociative identity disorder have one or multiple? That's a tough question. Probably, so dissociative identity, if they actually have multiple identities that are not aware of themselves, I would say probably yes, they have multiple consciousnesses. And I'm going to show you, not that disorder, but I'm going to show you about split brain patients here in a moment, and we can ask ourselves. It's a really interesting question. Great question. Any others? Yeah. Cool. So this other thing are these lab-grown mini-brains, and people call them organoids, and you can see a bunch of them sitting here, and these are neural cells that someone's like grown in a petri dish. You know, and a lot of people, especially people who are against animal research, think that this is the way we should go, that we should like test on these organoids and lab-grown mini-brains. I'll tell you, they're not anywhere near the place that we need them to be, and we just don't know a lot about them. For instance, when would these little lab-grown mini-brains become conscious? Right? And does that then change our obligations to these lab-grown mini-brains? But this is something already being played with and made. Okay, so traditionally there are two problems of consciousness. This is something that's in your book. There's what's known as the easy problem and the hard problem. So the easy problem is just quantifying and measuring consciousness. Can we figure out to identify if a person is conscious or not? Can we identify if a robot is or isn't? And the hard problem is about our subjective experience. How can I tell what your subjective experience of reality or of colors is? And does your consciousness give you some sort of executive control? Does it have an actual utility? Or is it an epiphenomena? So the very famous example about what an epiphenomena is this is a train with a steam engine, and you can see the steam coming out, and the steam has no real utility for the train to help it move. It's a result of the combustion that happened in the engine. So when people say an epiphenomena, they mean, is consciousness just like the steam of a steam engine, in which it has? It's kind of an illusion that we're conscious. It's just something that comes out of all our neural activity. Or is it the thing that actually, so there's a little person in a head here driving it, is it the thing that grants us our free will? Our ability to make decisions on our own, completely free of a deterministic reality. Science focuses on the easy problem, as you can guess, because that is something, right? This is the classification and validation, looking for clinical monitoring applications. And the hard problem, science is kind of staying out of because we're not sure we're ever going to be able to answer that. It's a lot of philosophical stuff. Maybe one day in the future. But when you talk about consciousness, you know, if you go home and talk about it tonight, when people generally conceptualize consciousness, they include both of these. This is what I meant earlier by researchers split up split up consciousness because they try to just focus on what we think we can get at, right, and leave the other stuff onto the side. So easy problem, hard problem. Okay. Oh, there we go. Are you conscious of all the computations occurring in your brain? What do you guys think? Are you conscious of everything happening in you? I see a lot of no's, right? Yeah, no, probably no way. All the brain areas that you've learned about this quarter, the amygdala, PFC, VTA, substantia nigra, like, you're not aware of all of these individual pieces, but you probably don't need to be, right? You just need to be aware of certain subsets of things. And another famous example I like is I want everybody right now, think about your toes in your shoes and how your toes are rubbing against your socks right now. Right? Now your consciousness has shifted to this thing, but you probably weren't thinking about it at all. Even though those neural signals were still going through your body and they were able to recognize them, it wasn't until I directed you to shift your attention to feel the sensation in your toes that you actually did. So that's one example of there's all these unconscious things being processed, but we're actually aware of a small subset. All right, so I got a little video here. Hopefully the sound plays. No.
But to this patient, P.S., they look...
Is that too loud?
Here are two images of a house. There's one obvious difference, but to this patient, P.S., they looked completely identical. P.S. had suffered a stroke that damaged the right side of her brain, leaving her unaware of everything on her left side. But though she could discern no difference between the houses, when researchers asked her which she would prefer to live in, she chose the house that wasn't burning. Not once, but again and again. P.S.'s brain was still processing information from her whole field of vision. She could see both images and tell the difference between them. She just didn't know it. If someone threw a ball at her left side, she might duck, but she wouldn't have any awareness of the ball, or any idea why she ducked. P.S.'s condition, known as hemispatial neglect, reveals an important distinction between the brain's processing of information and our experience of that processing. That experience is what we call consciousness. We are conscious of both the external world and our internal selves. We are aware of an image in much the same way we are aware of ourselves looking at an image, or our inner thoughts and emotions. But where does consciousness come from? Scientists, theologians, and philosophers have been trying to get to the bottom of this question for centuries without reaching any consensus. One recent theory is that consciousness is the brain's imperfect picture of its own activity. To understand this theory, it helps to have a clear idea of one important way the brain processes information from our senses. Based on sensory input, it builds models, which are continuously updating simplified descriptions of objects and events in the world. Everything we know is based on these models. They never capture every detail of the things they describe, just enough for the brain to determine appropriate responses. For instance, one model built deep into the visual system codes white light as brightness without color. In reality, white light includes wavelengths that correspond to all the different colors we can see. Our perception of white light is wrong and oversimplified, but good enough for us to function. Likewise, the brain's model of the physical body keeps track of the configuration of our limbs, but not of individual cells or even muscles, because that level of information isn't needed to plan movement. If it didn't have the model keeping track of the body's size, shape, and how it is moving at any moment, we would quickly injure ourselves. The brain also needs models of itself. For example, the brain has the ability to pay attention to specific objects and events. It also controls that focus, shifting it from one thing to another, internal and external, according to our needs. Without the ability to direct our focus, we wouldn't be able to assess threats, finish a meal, or function at all. To control focus effectively, the brain has to construct a model of its own attention. With 86 billion neurons constantly interacting with each other, there's no way the brain's model of its own information processing can be perfectly self-descriptive. But like the model of the body, or our conception of white light, it doesn't have to be. Our certainty that we have a metaphysical, subjective experience may come from one of the brain's models, a cut-corner description of what it means to process information in a focused and deep manner. Scientists have already begun trying to figure out how the brain creates that self-model. MRI studies are a promising avenue for pinpointing the networks involved. These studies compare patterns of neural activation when someone is and isn't conscious of a sensory stimulus, like an image. The results show that the areas needed for visual processing are activated whether or not the participant is aware of the image, but a whole additional network lights up only when they are conscious of seeing the image. Patients with hemispatial neglect, like PS, typically have damage to one particular part of this network. More extensive damage to the network can sometimes lead to a vegetative state with no sign of consciousness. Evidence like this brings us closer to understanding how consciousness is built into the brain, but there's still much more to learn. For instance, the way neurons in the networks related to consciousness compute specific pieces of information is outside the scope of our current technology. As we approach questions of consciousness with science, we'll open new lines of inquiry into human identity. To continue exploring life's big questions, check out
Sweet. So they talked about how we have this good enough brain that our perception of ourselves, so our consciousness, is just good enough to get us through. It's good enough to help us survive, but it's not perfect. But then there's this idea that we are unconscious of some things and conscious of others. And maybe there are parts of your brain that are responsible for consciousness and parts of your brain that are not, and they're processing unconscious information. And so we do have some examples of this from studies. So there's the case of what's known as blind sight. These people generally have a stroke, and they'll have damage to the geniculostriate pathway. Now, that sounds complicated, but you've learned about the lateral geniculate nucleus in the vision portion. So that's part of that, so geniculostriate pathway. And these subjects lack conscious awareness of objects in their damaged visual field. But when you ask them to point out things or describe it, they surprisingly to themselves can. So this cartoon is an example, and I promise you this is a real thing. You can find actual research studies on this. In this example, there should be another bubble here where this researcher, and there's the person with the stroke damage, the researcher says, "Describe to me what you see." And the person says, "But I'm blind. I can't see any stripes." And he says, "Well, just have a guess." He says, then I guess horizontal red stripes. And they'd be like, "Oh, you're right. You got it." Most of them actually are pointing. A lot of experiments I've done is they'll like point to the ball, and there'll be like different shapes, and the person will actually be able to point to the ball, and they're like, "Whoa, cool." So another example of this is prosopagnosia. Anybody heard of this before? This means, yeah, you have? Go ahead. What is it? Yep, face blindness, basically is what it's called. So the fusiform face area is an area of your brain that it's an area that is highly adaptive, and it allows us to discriminate things that are really important to us. And faces, as humans, are very, very important. There's so many subtle cues to emotions and stuff, and we're very social creatures. So this area is responsible for interpreting all of that. Sometimes called the fusiform face gyrus, but people with prosopagnosia will have damage to the fusiform face area, and they will lack conscious awareness of faces. If you got some spare time, highly recommend looking at some YouTube videos on it. It's really kind of sad but interesting at the same time. I've seen videos where this lady, she's looking at pictures of herself and her mom, and she can't recognize her own mom, but she's learned through her life to like look at their clothing and kind of get an idea. But we actually have done tests on this, and if you show someone with prosopagnosia a picture on the left of someone that they've recognized, and on the right you show them a picture of a complete stranger they've never experienced in their life, And then while doing this, you hook them up to a galvanic skin meter, and you measure their galvanic skin response. And what that is when your nervous system starts to amp up, you start to sweat a little bit. And the galvanic skin response is there's something measuring the conductivity on your skin. So when you start to sweat, there's more conductivity in your skin. And in this experiment, when people see the familiar face, they start to show an increased galvanic skin response. But when they see a stranger's face, they don't. So the idea here is that even though they can't recognize and say they have no idea who both of these people are, the familiar face still, their body unconsciously knows that they've experienced or have a memory of that person. And so just the key idea here is there are multiple information streams in your brain. There are some that allow us to be conscious and some that allow us to be unconscious. And this is what we're trying to figure out. Yep. Part of what? The question is the fusiform face area part of the ventral stream? I don't know. Good question, though. We should figure it out and put it on Piazza after. Yeah. Okay, so another example of something curious is colostomy. And this is done in instances of severe epilepsy. And right, the corpus callosum is you can see in this image here, it's this really thick fiber bundle. So all these axons, this white matter, it's in the middle of your brain, and it effectively connects your two hemispheres, allowing information to travel like a bridge across. The colostomy is a severing of this, and they actually just cut your brain right in half, basically. So the two sides, two hemispheres, cannot communicate with one another. This is what we call split brain patients. And people will ask, or even famous consciousness researchers think that you're actually creating two separate entities, two consciousnesses in the same brain. What's important to know is that these people still share a brain stem. They still share all of the core, very lower brain structures. So like heart rate and all that is still the same. But all of your cortical areas are disconnected. So there have been many different variations of this experiment. This is just one. So you've got a person here that has had a colostomy done. What's important to know for the left is that your left hemisphere has areas like Broca's area for speech. It does all your verbal processing. And remember that your right visual field projects to your left hemisphere, and your left visual field projects to your right hemisphere because the optic chiasm's up here and it's still intact. So if you put the word face just on the person's right side, so that it's projecting to their left hemisphere, and you ask them to say what they are seeing, they'll say, I see the word face. Really easy. But then if you put face on the left side, and you ask them again to say what they see, they'll say, I see nothing. Because this information is going to the right side, the right hemisphere, where you don't have speech processing. However, if you ask them to draw what they see, they will then draw a picture of a face of some sort. That's what they're smiling. Okay? And, really interesting. And I've seen actually a thought experiment by a consciousness researcher, because it can't technically be done in humans, where they freeze. They basically freeze one side of the brain to shut it down, and then the one side that's still active is complete. In the thought experiment, it's completely unaware of what the other side had just experienced, and they do vice versa. So really cool. All right, so let's talk about a few other lesions and disconnections. So, because this kind of tells us about what it is and what it isn't, consciousness. So cerebellum lesions do not affect consciousness, right? That back of your brain there, controlling fine motor movements, which is really interesting because it has 4 times more neurons than the cortex. They are very densely packed in the cerebellum. Right? So what this means is that just having more neurons doesn't necessarily mean that that area is controlling consciousness or that you're more conscious for having more neurons. Instead, what it means is that most likely it has something to do with the architecture or the wiring of the brain. Something intrinsic to the architecture that is allowing you to have consciousness. There are a few that can, like if we lesion your brainstem, boom, you're going to be out like a light. You might even die, or depending on what area of the brainstem. So, but I think most people would agree that the brainstem doesn't house consciousness. So it's kind of an interesting idea. You have to be careful when studying it about what is sufficient and what's necessary. Now, the areas that are kind of the areas that are hot topics of research are these cortical areas, different theories. I mean, we're still early in this stuff. We're just now starting. I'm going to show you some experiments, but we're just now starting to kind of get to an idea of defining it neurally. So we still don't have a huge consensus, but there's these two things. One's called the posterior hot zone. I'm going to show you an image of this in just a second, which is the back of your brain. It's a lot of your sensory systems, and they think that's what allows you to perceive reality. But then other theories think that the frontal cortex, right, your executive control center, they think that that's the area that is allowing you to be conscious. So the posterior hot zone is this area in the back of the brain. You can see there's temporal lobe, parietal, and some of the occipital. And it's thought that this is the cortical area playing a role in conscious perception. The reason is electrical stimulation of these areas, right? Just zapping it produces a wide range of sensations and feelings and can profoundly alter your current experience of reality. And Christoph Koch, who I'll talk about in a second, who's actually here in Seattle, one of the most famous consciousness researchers at the Allen Brain Institute, claims that stimulation of the frontal cortex usually does not change your perceptual experience. I'm teaching you this because this is what the theory states. One of my issues with this is that your thoughts, I think, are also part of your conscious experience, and I think if you manipulate the frontal cortex, you manipulate your cognition and your thoughts, so you could actually think differently if we stimulate it. You might have random thoughts. So let's get into some of these theories. So the two that I'm going to teach you about are the global workspace theory and then the integrated information theory. These are the two most famous theories that are kind of battling all the time in the media. They are actually battling about which ones think robots can become conscious. One thinks they can, one thinks they can't. So global workspace theory claims that, remember, NCCs, neural correlates of consciousness, that they lie in the prefrontal cortex, and I think your book focuses a lot on this. But it also kind of states that consciousness is this epiphenomenon. Integrated information theory claims that these NCCs lie in the posterior hot zone, the back of the brain, and it's a theory that thinks that consciousness allows us to exert a causal power on our experience, and it may be the thing that grants us free will. Again, this is Christoph Koch. He is a neuroscientist at the Allen Brain Institute here. He actually does a lot of talks here. I've been able to see a couple of his talks here at UW. And he's not the guy who founded this theory. He worked very closely with Giulio Tonani, who founded it, but he's a big proponent of it. Here's a little more about these. So global workspace theory claims that consciousness emerges when information is broadcasted to a global workspace. Again, this is the one that thinks it's an epiphenomenon. The idea here is that you have input of sensory data. It goes to this global workspace, which you can imagine is probably some network in the brain of multiple areas all on at once. And then that information gets broadcasted to the rest of the brain to be used, and they think that during this broadcasting, that's when we are conscious of it. I'll give you a real easier to understand example. So here, this is from their 1998 paper, and this is supposed to be a neuronal network, an architecture of a network. And you have up here evaluative systems. This could be your frontal cortex. Attentional systems, motor systems, perceptual systems, right? Occipital lobe, all of that, olfactory bulb. And then you have things for long-term memory. And these are all their separate nodes. And for example, I'm sure many of you know, most of you probably know how to drive. And you probably had this experience of, because I had this, when I was first learning to drive, like 14, 15, I'd have to think really hard about a lot of things when I was driving, about making, I had some anxiety, making sure I was doing everything right, and my mom would always yell at me about easing on the gas and the brake. And actually, I'd come to a stop sign, and I'd be hitting it hard, and the whole car would kind of jerk like forward. And she would yell at me all the time about it, and I kept thinking about it. And so during this time, while I'm learning, my perceptual systems in this theory are getting broadcasted to the global workspace, As I think about it, as I evaluate, they all kind of join together. And then they get outputted to the motor systems. And this only happens when you really need to focus and learn something. But now, and I'm sure as with many of you, I don't even have to think twice about it. It's something that just happens, and I just have those motor neurons, those connections are already wired in me. I don't have to think at all. And it's almost like I'm not conscious of that anymore. I don't know if you ever had the experience where you like drive a stretch of miles for 10 miles, and you're like, whoa, I went 10 miles already. You kind of just went there already. So in this theory now, your perceptual systems can now just, there's neural connections that go straight to your motor. They now bypass the global workspace once you've learned it. So that's one thing I like about this theory. It explains kind of consolidation and how over time you become less conscious of doing things that you are really good at. Yeah?
Would that be like why sometimes you don't remember driving somewhere?
Absolutely. Yeah, because you're so for those of you online, she says, is that why sometimes you don't remember driving somewhere? Yeah, because you're so good at driving that you don't even have to think, and you kind of go on this autopilot. And your global workspace here can be focused on something else. Yep.
Do we, conversely, when we shift in this process from a more focused mode to a more diffuse mode and to occupy that attention, can we actually make any mistakes like with tasks that actually require a lot of conscious and concentration?
Can you repeat that? I missed the last part. It's kind of hard to hear. Speak up a little more.
Do we make any mistakes that involves that actually involves a lot of like conscious and thoughts in the task itself, but we did that we already learned?
So you're saying, do we make mistakes during a conscious task? Do we predict? Can you reword that? I'm not really sure. Okay, post it on Piazza, and I'll answer. Yeah, what's a better way to word that? So, we got 8 minutes left. I think we'll make it. So, the other theory was integrated information theory. This one I'm a big fan of, and it talks about the amount of integrated information determines your level of consciousness. It actually is the theory that describes the scale of consciousness, and they call it phi. It claims consciousness is fundamental to living matter anywhere that you have any type of information. Information, that's the hard thing to define. How do you objectively define information? Claims that consciousness is fundamental, but the degree of it can vary. And as I mentioned, the back of the brain, that posterior hot zone, is what's argued to carry the architecture that allows the brain to exert causal power on itself. And what I mean by that is if you look here at this neural network, you'll see there's all these little nodes, and they have wiring, so like axons and neuron can talk to each other within the network. But what's important when we talk about causal power, it's this idea of recurrent connections, that these arrows come back and circle on themselves. They come back, and after information goes through the system, it can come back and then change what was initially put into the system. That's what they mean causal power. So this created this idea of phi, which is integrated information, and the assumption is that phi is correlated with consciousness. The reason I like this is the first theory to ever create a consciousness meter that actually worked. And this is within the last decade, so very recent. They call it the zap and zip. And what they do is they have TMS. So you guys learned about TMS, transmagnetic stimulation, sending magnetic pulses into the brain, right, which changes your neural activity a little bit. At the same time that they're doing TMS, they use EEG to record the neural activity. That's why they're zapping it, and then they're reading it, zap and zip. So, and what they're actually recording are, as they call, perturbations. This is kind of like when you drop a stone in a pond, standing water, you see the waves come out. That's what they're looking at in the brain. What is the effect of the TMS pulse? And this theory predicts that a system's level of phi, right, that consciousness variable, will influence the resulting perturbations. So the idea here is that a brain that is conscious, has a high level of phi, is highly integrated. That's what all these wires everywhere are going. And the idea is there's so much activity there that when you send TMS into it, the pulse, you won't get very many ripples. It'll be very small. All right. It's kind of like dropping a stone into raging water, a raging river. You won't really be able to see those ripples a lot, right? But on the other hand, a brain with lo-fi is kind of like dropping the stone into standing water, right? And you'll get a much bigger ripple, it'll be much clearer to see. That's the idea here. When they send that TMS pulse, they think what they record with EEG will be more dramatic. And so, thus, analyzing these perturbations caused by the TMS allow them to assess someone's level of consciousness and to literally create a consciousness meter. And what they call this the PCI, which is the Perturbational Complexity Index. So they've actually done a clinical study on this. Haven't looked recently. This was done in the last decade. And what's interesting is they had separate groups where they had people who they knew had locked-in syndrome because they had some people who had some motor output. And then they had another group of those who are thought to just be in straight coma. But the researchers, when they were testing the zap and zip method, they didn't know about the people with locked-in syndrome, that they had some motor, and they were correctly able to identify 37 out of 38 of those people and tell that they had some consciousness. But what's really interesting to me is that there were 40 people who were thought to be in a coma, and they found that 34 of them were in a coma, but that means 36 of them were probably still conscious to some level, if this is right. So, so this is literally the world's first consciousness meter, besides being able to just ask you and hope that you get a motor command. So really new stuff. All right, so there are many more theories out there on consciousness. Consciousness as a temporal circuit. This is this idea of you have networks of area, say you have the amygdala, there's something called a default mode network, which is 3 brain areas active at once. And if you look at how these brain areas shift through time on and off, you can actually define if someone's conscious. Consciousness and quantum mechanics starting to get out there, but that's a fun one that people like to throw around. Lots of others. So that's everything I have for consciousness. I want to say one more thing. I want to put a plug for Gray Matters. Has anyone heard of this? If you guys love the topics in this class, if you want a career in any type of scientific brain journalism, this is our undergraduate neuroscience journal here at UW. There's a website, graymattersjournal.com. And you can see there's all these publications. They're nice publications. They're Scientific American quality. And actually, this one right here, this Pleasure of Music one, this is an article I wrote in 2015 on consciousness, on the IAT theory, so you can see it. But it's all the things that students are excited about here. And so they're probably things that you would think exciting, and it looks great on your CV. You get to nerd out with people about the brain. Highly recommend it. Okay, so that's everything I got for you. Are there any questions? Cool. All right, guys. Good luck on the final. See you later.